Honduran farmers and journalists face record levels of violence in a country known as the murder capital of the world. What's behind the attacks against them? And is anyone being held accountable? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. The United Nations Special Freedom of Expression Rapporteur is calling on the Honduran government to investigate the murders of 22 journalists over the last 2 years. Since Manuel Zelaya was ousted in 2009, Honduras has become one of the most dangerous countries for members of the media. According to Reporters Without Borders, those who cover the so-called drug war and land disputes are often targeted by narco-traffickers, criminal gangs, as well as corrupt state authorities. Members of the country's powerful oligarchy are also implicated in the violence. This man, Miguel Facusse, is the most powerful businessman in Honduras. Reporters Without Borders calls him a, quote, press predator who, quote, paved the way for a crackdown on opposition and grassroots media, end quote. Al Jazeera's Fault Lines presenter Zaina Awad traveled to Facusse's stronghold in the Aguan Valley, where she found that it's not just journalists who are being targeted.
Commercial interests are at the heart of one of Honduras's oldest and ongoing human rights crises. Since the coup, more than 50 farmers or campesinos have been assassinated by security guards of wealthy landowners in the Aguan Valley, one of Honduras's most fertile regions. The campesinos are trying to reclaim territory once allocated to their families by occupying the land.
No somos personas que le hacemos daño a nadie, simplemente reclamamos un derecho que nos pertenece.
Vitorino Alvarez says his people are willing to die to reclaim that right. Dominga's husband was one of the most recent casualties. Matias Valle was shot dead by 2 attackers on a motorcycle. Now, Dominga has to raise their 6 children by herself.
El más chiquito tiene 3 añitos.
Many families have lost loved ones here, including Vitorino.
Eso me ha pasado montones de veces. Cuando me habla mi sobrina y me dicen que acaban de asesinar, 2 tipos en una moto acaban de asesinar a mi sobrino, no lo podía creer. Él era como mi hijo.
The bulk of the land is owned by just 3 men. Its value has soared as palm oil, cultivated widely here, has become a lucrative biofuel. We're passing by Miguel Facusse's property. He's the biggest landowner here in the Aguan Valley. He's a very powerful businessman. WikiLeaks released a cable from the US Embassy showing that his property has been used as a landing strip for drugs coming in from Colombia. Facusse was never held accountable for the drug trafficking incidents. Human rights groups and campesinos have accused his security guards of working alongside US-trained police and military in carrying out many of the killings. Adolfo Facusse is his nephew. We met him at a government-sponsored investor conference and asked him about the killings.
I mean, what happens if somebody breaks into your house? What do you do? You let them do whatever they want to do to you? Or you defend your home and your person?
Is it right for them to be killed off by private security guards without any real investigation?
I think, look, I mean, nobody likes the killings of anybody. But for example, I don't know if the ones you met, but there are some in there, I mean, that is not campesinos. They don't carry, how say, implements of cultivation, but they carry AK-47.
Within 5 days of our visit here, 2 more campesinos were murdered.
Y no va a ver usted una tan siquiera persona diciendo que están presos por el asesinato de tantos campesinos que han habido en el Bajo Aguan. Los gobiernos, en vez de darnos el apoyo a nosotros, más bien está creando leyes para hundir más a los pobres de este país.
And you can watch all of Zaina's report on Friday at 16:30 GMT or 12:30 p.m. Eastern, and on Saturday at 22:30 GMT, 18:30 Eastern, as well as on our website at aljazeera.com. So what's behind the attacks on journalists and campesinos? To discuss this, we're joined here in the studio by Annie Bird, the co-director of Rights Action, by Dalphine Hagland, the DC Director for Reporters Without Borders, and Honduras historian Dana Frank, who joins us from Mountain View, California. Annie Bird, then, help us understand first then the origins of the dispute in the Aguan Valley.
Well, the Aguan Valley was populated through the Agrarian Reform Program in Honduras, and so campesinos small farmers were brought out to the area to turn essentially jungle into African palm plantations. And then in the early 90s, there was a change in the laws, the Agrarian Reform laws, that allowed these lands to be sold. And then what accompanied that was a tremendous amount of pressure on cooperatives to sell their land by businessmen like Miguel Facusse and a few others who used fraud and also violence and threats to essentially force small farmers and cooperatives to sell their land.
So this is all part of that neoliberal economic model we've seen throughout, from Mexico down south, where they move away from food security and small holdings and so forth to a globalized agrarian economy where it's all about export and so forth.
Right, and the small farmers the cooperatives were already producing African palm, but what it did was it concentrated the ownership of the industry into the hands of a few businessmen, as opposed to, and the farmers then became the laborers on the.
But does that mean that Facusse and other large agribusiness do in fact own title deeds for this land?
Well, I mean, the thing is that most of those, there were 28 cooperatives that initiated legal cases against Facusse and some other palm oil businessmen. And most of them couldn't sustain 18 years of paying lawyers in a civil suit. But 4 of them did, and actually there's a new round of tensions and violence in July that's happened in the Aguan that was really began and was touched off by a June 29th eviction of Facusse and his security guards and from a couple of the other palm oil businessmen from those 4 farms that where the cooperatives had continued and been able to continue paying lawyers and then the court eventually ruled in their favor that yes, those title transfers were fraudulent, and the land was returned legally to the cooperatives. The problem is that there are 24 other cooperatives that went through exactly the same experience, but because of the repression, the poverty, the difficulty in the Honduran justice system, and they couldn't sustain legal cases for 18 years.
Professor Frank, then, this name, Miguel Facusse, keeps coming up, and it's often said that Honduras' economy is basically controlled by a few families. Facusse, clearly one of the key figures in that. I mean, who is he exactly?
Facusse has been described by the U.S. Embassy as the richest and most powerful man in Honduras, and as one of the key backers of the coup 3 years ago that overthrew democratically elected President Manuel Zelaya. He's a very dangerous man. He has a private security army of 200 or 300 private security guards controlled by his Dinant Corporation. He sends threatening and intimidating letters to people who dare to criticize him in public, and there's a great deal of fear of him in Honduras. He's almost like a private warlord out there in the Aguan Valley, and he's one of these top political families that controls the Honduran state. And he, again, as the documentary points out, there are WikiLeaks that show that the U.S. Embassy has known since 2004 that planes carrying drugs have landed on his property. Planes coming in from Colombia have unloaded cocaine on his property since 2004. The embassy still knows that. They still haven't denounced him, and he still hasn't been prosecuted for any of this.
Yeah, well, actually, we have a bit more of that WikiLeaks cables. It basically says what you just told us. Information about a known drug trafficking flight with a 1,000-kilo cocaine shipment from Colombia. A law enforcement source provided information that the aircraft successfully landed March 14th on the private property of Miguel Facusse. Sources informed the police that the aircraft successfully landed March 14th. Its cargo was offloaded onto a convoy of vehicles that was guarded by about 30 heavily armed men. Of additional interest is that this incident marks the third time in the last 15 months that drug traffickers have been linked to this property owned by Mr. Facusse. But the interesting thing, Annie Bird, is Mr. Facusse is clearly very much plugged into the global corporate economic system. He's the recipient of World Bank money. He's been cleared for UN clean development mechanism funds for carbon mitigation. He's making the most out of the biofuel boom and the look for market-based solutions to climate change and things like that.
Exactly. And, you know, he is one expression of a problem that's happening throughout the region. In neighboring Guatemala, there are communities that are being completely displaced by huge new extensions of sugarcane for ethanol, new plantations of also of African palm, and there's a tremendous amount of social dislocation through violence also. You know, violence being enacted against indigenous communities in some cases that have lived on their land and in their region for centuries, and so it's being accompanied by the implementation of a drug war, a war against drugs in Central America by the U.S. government. And in many cases, what we've seen in different parts of Central America, including Honduras, is that where there's interests in land, the government starts, you know, calling people drug traffickers.
Well, we'll look into that in a bit more detail a bit later. But I mean, I guess the irony is then, so I mean, he's also meanwhile being linked to all these worthy, supposed market-based environmental causes. But the problem is then that it's not his land, as far as many campesinos think. Were his interests, Professor Frank, actually threatened by Manuel Zelaya, the man who was overthrown in that coup? I mean, all that Zelaya really was doing, I mean, he's often presented as some sort of firebrand leader, but he was pretty modest in his aims, really, just constitutional reform and a few agrarian projects. I mean, was he that threatened?
No, Zelaya was one of the the Zelaya, the deposed president, comes from one of these traditional political elite families himself. And like you say, he was not threatening. He did, in fact, raise the minimum wage for certain sectors of the economy, and he did buy oil from Venezuela, which was a tremendous threat to the international oil companies. But it's not like he was the flaming radical that he's been painted as. And these very minor measures were such a threat to the Honduran oligarchs that they staged this military coup on June 28th, 2009, and packed him off to Costa Rica, famously in his pajamas. And Miguel Facusse has been established. You can see that in the U.S. Embassy cables as one of the key figures machinating the coup. In fact, the embassy continued to meet with him after the coup, knowing all this. And so the oligarchs were, with Facusse at the top of this, they want a neoliberal economic environment. They want to have the ability to extract all the mining and other environmental resources out of the country without any environmental regulations. They want to privatize the entire government or eliminate it altogether in some models. And they were threatened by any kind of functioning state that actually put brakes on their economic exploitation. So Facusse is just the tip of the iceberg of what these oligarchs want.
Meanwhile, though, the other thing after the coup then, Delphine, is we have this sudden explosion of the murder of journalists. I mean, has it actually properly been explained why 4 years before the coup, only one journalist had been killed?
Yeah.
However, since the coup, 22 have been killed. Why?
Yeah. So as you say, we really observe an escalation of press freedom violation and violent attacks against journalists. It's just that now in Honduras, the journalists who dare to report on human rights violation or the rural land conflicts, they know that they could face serious reprisals.
But is there a pattern there? I mean, when you look at the beats of the journalists who were killed, what were they covering exactly?
They were covering, as I say, human rights violation, police corruption, and also, of course, the situation in Bajo Aguan, and also they could also cover criminal gang activities or Facusse. So there are many origins of the threats, but that's sure that the situation is just becoming worse and worse.
But why did Reporters Without Borders call Facusse
a predator?
A predator, the man who laid the foundation for this sort of violence?
Yeah, because we observe a lot of attacks and threats to community radio. We try to cover what is happening there. So we estimate that Facusse, he doesn't want people to talk about what's happening. So he doesn't want journalists and Honduras journalists to spread the word about what's happening.
Well, let's talk about what is happening then. Annie Bird, tell us more about the sort of resistance that we were seeing in Zaina Awad's report a few moments ago. I mean, how are they faring? What sort of resistance are they facing from Facusse and his security forces?
Well, actually, right now there's a lot of tension in the area, and troops, there's a lot of threats of massive evictions of small farmers who are occupying farms that they argue they have a legal right and are the legal owners of. So in July, there were a number of new farms that were occupied. One of them was this Bajo Aguan farm, which that occupation was spurred because security guards there kidnapped a local resident of a neighboring community. And the community was able to mobilize, get the police in to help them search. They found his grave on the farm, and they found evidence of other people who had been disappeared from the area within the farm, like bicycles that had belonged to them. And we're insisting that the area be searched for clandestine graves, which but instead of assisting the communities, the authorities, the police, and the military were threatening evictions. And so the communities took control of the farm, and largely because they don't want this presence of armed assassins in the middle of their communities. They're tired of having their neighbors murdered.
What about this link then between the military and the police and these private security forces? Is there a clear
There's
link?
a very, very fluid link. The commander of one of the heads of security for Facusse used to be the commander of the 15th Battalion there. There are many reports that there are private security guards that change into military uniforms when they're going in to do an eviction, or will wear uniforms and go into the military base and receive training. There are reports that there are Colombian trainers on the bases, training the military there that participates in the evictions, but then also the U.S. Army Rangers. And there's, there seems to be a really fluid movement between the security guards and the military.
Professor Franklin, this is clearly where the US does come in. Their money is being used to train and equip forces in Honduras, but is there any clear evidence that those forces that the US is funding are killing campesinos and journalists?
Well, we know that they've trained this is very hard to track. In fact, there are real transparency issues about who is the United States actually training in Honduras. We do know that the military forces in the Aguan Valley have been trained by the U.S. We also know that there are the generals who perpetrated the coup were trained for the most part at the School of the Americas. And we know that the U.S. is pouring police and military training money into Honduras as we speak. They have, though, acknowledged just last week that the current national chief of police has been accused of death squad activities. And so miraculously, because of congressional pressure, not because of the State Department, a small piece of the funding for the U.S. funding for the Honduran police was just temporarily suspended
Actually,
until
can you clear that up? We've been terribly
chief
confused.
of police can be investigated.
We have been confused about that. And, it was reported widely, I think AP had a report that this funding had stopped. But when we're looking at the small print, it seems, what has happened? I mean, assistance has been carefully limited, I'm seeing phrases. What does that mean?
Well, two things have happened. One is that the United States, rather outrageously, the State Department has certified that other than the chief of police, the human rights situation in Honduras is fine, that freedom of expression and freedom of speech and due process and law are all just fine. And that's a very outrageous thing that people should know about, that the State Department just certified. But they did say that this 20% of the funds that has to be certified for human rights abuses before it can be released, they said that 20% of that money cannot go to forces that are supervised by the National Chief of Police, El Tigre Bonilla, Juan Carlos Bonilla, until the accusations against him being a death squad leader have been properly investigated. So that money is held up from going to just to his forces that are supervised by him. The rest of the money is completely flowing, and that money can continue to flow to other units.
All right, so then, Annie Bird, you alluded to this. There is this expansion of the war on drugs, and this military. It's not just the police, but the military now are getting involved. And we've had recent cases in which questions have been raised about the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency's role in some of these. You've just come up with a report that suggests it might be deeper than we've been told. How does this, is this about drugs though? How does this connect to what the sort of campesino, the war on drugs, how is that actually affecting the sort of campesino struggles we've been talking about in La Agua?
Well, there's, what we're seeing a pattern in the region is that anytime there's tensions between the government and then sectors like campesinos or indigenous communities that are advocating for their rights and their land rights, the specter of the accusation of involvement in drug trafficking is always...
Isn't there a drug trafficking problem in Honduras? Actually, even after the coup, especially. Actually.
Right, there is, and as you can see, Facusse has been accused of allowing that to happen on his land by, the State Department. But instead of addressing how many of the people in the highest levels of government and in the highest levels of most powerful sectors of business and whatnot are directly involved, they're basically playing this multi-billion-dollar war of whack-a-mole with drug interdictions, which are highly, risky, put the population at risk, people who are essentially bystanders, and can also be manipulated and used to repress people who are seeking to advocate for their rights as opposed to actually going after drug traffickers.
But are you suggesting the US is flooding this region then with cash, which is then being used by the military and the police to uphold the position of the local oligarchs who themselves are thought by the US to be involved in drug trafficking?
Yeah, pretty much. And one thing that's very concerning, for example, right now they're creating in Honduras, they've announced that they're creating a new hybridized security force, which is sort of a hybrid between the military and the police, and it's an intelligence unit. And their job title seems to be a description of exactly what some U.S. intelligence units are said to be doing in the region now in terms of managing intelligence and surveillance around the drug war. But there's a lot of fear that and they're called the Tigres, and there's a lot of fear that this could be used, this could become another Battalion 316, another death squad that kidnaps and kills people.
And meanwhile, Professor Frank, then there was this attempt by Zelaya to have limited democratic reform, which might have given perhaps a bit more transparency, a little less reliance on these big families who are allegedly implicated in the drug trade, and yet the US was against that.
Yeah, we know that the U.S. fudged after the coup. Obama refused to ever call it a military coup and essentially recognized Micheletti, the coup perpetrator, as an equal partner after the coup and recognized the clearly very bogus election of the current president, Porfirio Pepe Lobo, when the opposition, almost all the opposition, boycotted the election along with almost all international observers. And that's who's in power now, Porfirio Pepe Lobo. The United States continues to support him with tremendous enthusiasm and referring to this as a fictional government of national reconciliation, despite the 10,000 denunciations by Honduran people against human rights violations
but then is the US's
by the
main
Honduran
concern,
state security forces.
Is the US's main concern in Honduras then, Annie Bird? Is it drugs, or is it keeping these sort of oligarchs in as some sort of bulwark against the sort of changes we've seen further south in Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, and elsewhere?
That's what I would argue, that there's a really strong security interest in securing U.S. business and economic interests in the region, and that there's too much of a pattern of the intersection of natural resources that they're interested in and the supposed drug war.
But is this different arms of the government who have different priorities, perhaps the DEA and State Department and other things, or or is there some sort of plan, just as far as you can tell? Then?
Well, I think the Southern Command, I can't remember the statement exactly, but they make statements that make that clear, that in the New York Times reported on May 7th when they were first discussing some of the FAST team, the DEA's military-style unit that's operating in the region. The Southern Command made a statement to the effect of that one of their objectives is creating a stable environment for business interests. There's an intersection there. There is instability because of the problems of organized crime, But the problems, those are structural problems that have to be addressed on a structural level, and that go back to the reason for the coup.
Annie Burt, thank you very much. Professor Dana Frank, thank you very much. Dalphine Hagland, thank you too. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.